So to finish up that last point, in this bacterium, this mutation allowed it to immediately benefit from its environment of having lots of plastic around to consume. Okay, so with animals and plants, it's a little more complicated because we have larger genomes. So on average, we get one mutation for every 100,000 genes per generation. So this, what's referred to as this background mutation rate, is fairly low. There's long spans between generations, right? Some animals don't reproduce until decades have passed. And diploid genomes prevent most mutations from significantly affecting genetic variation from one generation to the next, because since we are diploid organisms, if one of the alleles or genes is mutated, it could get masked, especially if it's a recessive allele. With sexual reproduction, in organisms that reproduce sexually, most genetic variation in a population results from the mixing and matching of alleles that an individual inherits from its parents. So it's the assortments of existing alleles that arise in every generation that leads to much of the genetic variation in sexually reproducing organisms. And there's three components of this genetic variation through sexual reproduction. One is the independent orientation of the homologous chromosomes that align in meiosis. So you can go back and take a quick look at that as needed. Then also crossing over that occurs in meiosis. Remember the recombination of bits of the chromatids on the homologous chromosomes when they're aligned. Remember prophase 1. Again, go back and take a look at that, meiosis. And then lastly, the random fertilization. Any particular sperm might fertilize a particular egg. So three components to genetic variation in sexual reproduction. So populations as a unit evolve. So remember, as I mentioned, the individual doesn't evolve, populations evolve. And natural selection is only seen in terms of evolution in populations of organisms over generational time. So what is a population? It's a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species that live in the same area. So, like a population of cheetah in the African savanna, or a population of gazelles. So at the population level, biologists focus on the gene pool. So all copies of every allele within all members of a population. So microevolution, think of micro as small, this is the generation to generation change in the combination of frequencies, what's called allele frequencies in a population. So it's called the change in the allele frequency. So for example, in a population of woodpeckers, if this individual happens to be more successful at surviving and reproducing than this individual, and this individual has more offspring, or has offspring, and this individual does not, the genetic alleles that this individual has will become more common in the next generation of this population versus the alleles that this individual might have. And alleles in particular that are going to determine the beak or bill size in this example. So all the alleles in the population of these woodpeckers is called the gene pool. And if there's a change in the percentage of those alleles in a population over time, because of differential reproductive success, like this individual is going to reproduce more and have more offspring than this one, we can see a change in the allele frequency. So that's a change in the genetic composition of the population, in this case of woodpeckers, and that's called microevolution. Evolution in a population at the genetic level. So here's another little example. Population of beetles, variation in color, natural selection. birds that are going to more readily eat the green ones that stand out in their environment. That means the brown ones are going to survive more and more likely reproduce, so differential reproduction based on natural selection. So over time, the alleles of the brown or tan beetles are going to become more common in the population. The alleles of the green beetles, less common. The alleles are determining beetle color in this case. So this is microevolution over time. Speciation hasn't occurred yet, but you can only get speciation occurring, something that's called a macroevolution, by getting enough microevolution occurring first. So what are the mechanisms that will change these allele frequencies in a gene pool? Natural selection is one, and it's the most important one because it's the only process that will promote adaptation, meaning modification of organisms over time to their particular habitats or environments. Another cause of changes in allele frequencies is genetic drift. So genetic drift is a change in the gene pool, meaning the allele frequencies in a population, of a small population, usually, due to chance. So for example, let's say there's a relatively small population of flowers in a particular habitat, and you get a chance fire that wipes out a significant portion of them. That's some chance event, and that can lead to a change in the gene distribution, the allele frequencies in a population. And this type of change is called genetic drift. So for example, you might have a generation of a population of a particular species of flower. Fire wipes out half of them, only 50% survive. And only of those 50%, if they reproduce, in this case, if it's these individuals, their alleles, indicated by the dominant recessive alleles here, are going to become more common in a population. And let's say there's another fire or an avalanche or a severe rainstorm or a severe freeze that wipes out even more. Only 2 of the 10 plants survive. Now notice that these individuals by chance happen to have dominant alleles, and in the surviving members of the next generation of the population of these flowers, there's clearly been a change in the distribution of the alleles. In fact, the recessive allele has gotten wiped out by chance. So this is referred to as genetic drift, and it has this biggest effect on small populations. Okay, so a little video here on mechanisms of evolutionary change. Get the volume up for you. Here we go.
Variation is found in human populations and in other populations, such as this population of island beetles. Color in these beetles is determined by different versions of a gene, different alleles. Green is the dominant trait, so green beetles have 2 green alleles, or a green allele and a brown allele. Brown beetles have 2 brown alleles. By counting the brown alleles and green alleles, we can calculate that this population has 30% brown alleles and 70% green alleles. The frequency of brown alleles is greater than the frequency of brown beetles because some green beetles have a brown allele. Allele frequencies change as populations evolve. What causes populations to evolve? The island is suffering from a drought, and in this dry environment, brown beetles are better camouflaged than green beetles. Birds are more likely to see and eat green beetles. Over time, brown beetles survive and reproduce more than green beetles. This is an example of natural selection. Individuals with inherited traits better suited to their environment survive and produce more offspring than other individuals. Here, natural selection causes the frequency of the brown allele to increase. Through natural selection, The population has become better adapted to its new environment. Genetic drift occurs when populations evolve due to chance events. Let's see how genetic drift affects this small population of beetles. Chance constantly affects which beetles actually reproduce and which of their alleles they pass on. In a small population, chance events produce large fluctuations in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. Here, the frequency of the brown allele has decreased to 0, and the population is left with only green beetles. Genetic drift also occurs in large populations. But in a large population, genetic drift has less effect because it causes much smaller fluctuations in allele frequencies. Other random events can also lead to genetic drift. By chance, this volcano kills more brown beetles than green beetles, causing the frequency of the green allele to increase. Gene flow describes evolution due to individuals moving into or out of a population. When green and brown beetles migrate into the all-green population, the frequency of the brown allele increases. Natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow are the major mechanisms responsible for the evolution of all populations. Together, they shape populations of beetles as well as humans.
Some good little visuals there on that video. So let's talk about the bottleneck effect, and it's an example of genetic drift that results from a huge reduction in population size. So again, some chance random event, again, like say a massive fire, will reduce the population size vastly, and will also decrease the genetic variation in a population because at least some of the alleles would likely be lost from a gene pool. So the analogy here with a population of individuals, the little beads, and the different colors indicate different alleles. So with the bottleneck effect, referring to most of the individuals perishing and only a few survive, the surviving population more than likely is not going to have the same distribution of alleles as the original population. So bottleneck, since it's referred to as bottleneck because only a few survive. If the surviving population rebounds and their population gets to be as big as it was before, it will still have a lower genetic variation than the original population and has lost some of the alleles. So that's an example of genetic drift. All right? And the bottleneck effect is an example or one type of genetic drift. Okay? So cheetahs, for example, experienced at least 2 genetic bottlenecks in the past. One was in the last ice age about 10,000 years ago, and then in the 1800s when they were hunted to near extinction. Both events reduced their populations greatly. So with very little genetic variability, cheetahs today have a reduced capacity to adapt to environmental changes, even if their population numbers are relatively high. Okay, so the founder effect is another type of a genetic drift event, another example of genetic drift, where a few individuals colonize an isolated habitat and represents genetic drift in a new colony. So for example, if you have an original population and only a few individuals migrate to new habitat or a new place or new environment, more than likely the genetic allele frequencies distribution is going to be different because only a small section, a small fraction of the original population is represented in the new population. Okay? So notice here 20 blue alleles, 10 red alleles. If only a few individuals become a founding population, the allele frequencies are more likely going to shift. So it explains founder effect of relatively high frequencies of certain inherited disorders in some small human populations, like in the United States, like within